On a planet called Origin, where life is suspiciously similar to Earth's, sapient life is pretty diverse. There's invertebrates, arthropods, mammals, and even plants that are capable of complex thought and personhood. But only one has been able to dominate the planet so entirely in recent millennia, the dragons who call themselves the Ñushus. Allow me to start this video with a story to catch you up to today, starting 5 million years ago. The Ñushus story takes place in Origin's occidental and glacial continents, to the west and north of the global map. One race, the Dracoñe, lived in the islands, while the other, the Relic, lived in the continent to the south. The Relics had access to metals like silver and copper, so their technology was more advanced than the Dracoñe, who only had wood and stone. The former drove the latter out of the island to loot their homes and steal their land. The Dracoñe were forced out into the sheer cold of the glaciate, and many didn't survive. After going all the way around the mountain, they settled in the moderately habitable taiga of the deep glaciate. That was where they speciated into the Dracoñe we know today. Meanwhile, the Relics had their own history. They had taken over what they thought was the whole world, and had cities all over, from what became the desert to the edge of the sea. By 10,000 years ago, they had an elaborate democratic republic. Between that time, an event happened that we don't know very much about. The desert had formed, and through the generations they forgot the cities they had built in the oasis, and viewed the entire desert as uninhabitable. The Relics had 3 other kinds of people under their rule: the Ostfo, the Pseudosians, and the Lycans. Side note, most of what we know about Relic Ñushus was preserved by Lycan historians. When these people did something illegal, or something perceived as legal, they were enslaved and used to support the Relic economy. The Ñushus were horribly cruel to these other species, but other Relics were held to a higher standard. When they committed serious enough crimes, they were exiled to what they thought was a certain death in the desert. But as we know today, the desert was really only a barrier that surrounded a vast oasis. Through the years, these exiled Relics settled within what might have been a group of Relics who split from the rest long ago when the desert formed. By 10,000 years ago, they had speciated into another race called the Drañyn. What's so important about 10,000 years ago? An event lost to time caused the Drañyn to invade that vastly outnumbered Relics. The Relics either died or integrated with the Drañyn. A few years later, the Dracoñe saw the perfect opportunity to invade the weakened southern Ñushus and took their reign that has lasted to modern day. These circumstances had to do with their biology, which I'll talk about next. The Dracoñe, also known as red Ñushus, had the scientific name Yoshus lenta lenta. The second lenta is to signify the subspecies. Like any Ñushus, they have tough skin, huge arms, a stark sexual dimorphism, and 2 voice boxes. Their height ranges on average from 180 to 240 centimeters, and their weight from 90 to 180 kilograms. Their skin can get up to a centimeter thick, making blunt force attacks a breeze to handle. Their arms can easily lift 200 kilograms, and they use them to gallop at startling speeds. All Ñushus have noticeable dimorphism, with especially the horns of males being larger and having extra ends, and male Dracoñe specifically are much larger on average than females. The males grow slower, reaching adult size after 30 years of age compared to the females' 20. It's only when the hair on the sides of their heads starts to silver that a Ñushus is considered an adult. If you hear someone being called a silver temple or a silver temple Ñushus, they're simply referring to them as an adult. It isn't until a few years before they die of old age that their body actually begins to wither past their prime, which is part of what made them as successful as they are. For most of these things, Dracoñe have a more drastic dimorphism than Drañyn. Lastly, for the dimorphism thing is that after puberty, females have a weird effect in their eyes that makes it impossible to look at them. Anyone with vertebrate eyes will be forced to close them or turn away. From a camera or the eyes of an arthropod witness, the eyes of a female Ñushus look completely normal. Because of this, they usually cover up their eyes and learn to see using magic, which I'll talk about later. Anyway, the last thing I mentioned for a general Ñushus is that they have 2 voice boxes. They have an organ that's very similar to a syrinx in birds. The syrinx doesn't have vocal cords, but it makes sounds based on the vibrations on its walls. It's located right where the trachea diverges into the lungs, which allows it to work differently for either side in Ñushus. One side is thicker than the other, allowing one voice box to be loud while the other is a deeper rumble. The louder one is what they use most frequently for communication, while the growl is used in tandem with the other side when emotions are high or used by itself for various purposes. One last thing is that Ñushus have a facial expression unique to them and other dragons. A popular example is from a clip in Christopher Mendelgaard's hit documentary To Catch a Calvin Gem from 2004. I know the resolution is low quality, but I hope you can see his mouth opening wide when he's facing the monster. This is called dragging, and it's used to show you're ready to throw hands. It's probably evolved because of their main attack, a powerful energy beam straight from their mouth. It's called the laser bomb. Let's talk more about what makes Dracoñe different from other Ñushus. The most noticeable difference is their red color, specifically their horns, which are the main thing used to identify someone's race. The forks of the male's horns point downward, and the primary part tends to point inward, though in Northern Dracoñe it points outward. There are also more physical differences like their larger size. Female Dracoñe are the same height as female Taniyn, but have a much higher body fat percentage. Males are much larger with a similarly high body fat percentage, but are quite a bit taller on average than male Taniyn, 25 centimeters taller to be specific. Dracoñe have weird hair. It tends to be wavy, but that's not the weird part. They're the only animal on origin that normally gets male pattern baldness, and most are actually born with lots of body hair, which they usually lose as they get older. However, about 10% of them keep this body hair into adulthood. This gets more common as you go more north, with about 50% of Silver Temple Dracoñe from the foot of origin having thick body hair. Taniyn have the scientific name Yoshus lenta Velex to signify their faster metabolisms. They're obviously green, but are unique in their own ways as well. The forks on the male's horns point outward, and the primary part tends to point forward, though in the far west it points upward. Their dimorphism has less of a difference in their height and weight, so male Taniyn are more similarly sized to females of any race and have a more similar growth rate, though their lifespan is still much shorter. Most females go through an odd stage where they lose their lips entirely by the age of 20 to grow them back by the time they're 30. They have a low body fat percentage and store a notable amount of water in their horns. They tend to have straight dark hair, though less than 1% of Taniyn from Tombstone are born with curly red hair. Most are born with the ability to sweat, which they usually lose as they get older. However, about 30% of them keep this ability into adulthood. This is most common in Tombstone, where over 90% of Silver Temple Taniyn can sweat. They all speak a language based on the Dracoñe alphabet. Technically, they'd pronounce it the Dracoñe. I won't get too much into it, but it's the most common alphabet on origin, and it's used across the Glaciant and in most of the Occident. Even though Sudosians don't speak anything similar to Dracoñe, they use that alphabet in their written language. The reason Sudosia is spelled with an X has to do with how it's translated from Dracoñe. The only other written alphabets on origin are Anthroposan, Lycan, and now Pamalago. Dracoñe and Taniyn, split before the last letter, pronounced Ñynfin, was added, which is why the Taniyn isn't spelled with the Enya, or whatever you call the N with the squiggly thing on top of it in English. Side note, sorry to break the immersion, I'm not a language maker, so most of these look like existing languages. Sorry, it's not a lore thing. Unless it is, ooh. Another species of people that's inseparable from Ñush's history is the Rifa. Lycan historians tell of the ancient people's fierce rivalry with barbarian fire ants that walked on 6 legs and flew with blazing wings. From what we can tell, the Rifa we know today are domesticated variants of this otherwise extinct people. They were first domesticated by the Relic Ñushus, and further kept as servants and slaves by the Taniyn and Dracoñe who took their place. They were useful because they were unaffected by the thing with the eyes. I'm just going to refer to it as the thing with the eyes from now on. So royal women didn't have to worry about covering their eyes from around their maids, and slave security guards couldn't be affected by any shenanigans regarding that. One of these days I'll have a full video about Rifa, but for now all you gotta know is that males and queens are so rare they're basically non-existent, and there are 2 types of workers. Minor workers who have higher intelligence and were trained to act as a servant or maid or butler, while major workers had a lower intelligence but were about as strong as a Ñushus. The major workers usually did heavy slave labor for little to no payment. Rifa were a big part of the nationwide movement to give rights of personhood to a wider variety of species. It helped that their situation was so egregiously horrible that most people were on their side. Nowadays, both forms of Rifa are recognized as people, and while lots of them still do jobs for royal Ñushus, they're legally required to be compensated for it like anyone else. As a result of how close they've been to Ñushus for thousands of years, there are lots of love stories between Rifa and Ñushus. Anyway, now we can finally talk about Ñushus culture. 10 minutes into the video. The North Dracoñe tend to live around the foot of origin, which is the base of the capital and mountains in the Glacian. They were the Dracoñe who stayed in the taiga they had lived in for millions of years, instead of moving south to take back the land of their ancestors. The most important part of any culture is food, so how'd they get that in the taiga? Historically, men would go into the harsh cold outside their settlement and collect what meat they could find along with some lumber, while women stayed inside to not only to take care of their own home, but also to work on developing their settlement, like politics and stuff. Men were considered brutish but strong, while women were competent and caring. Sometime a few hundred years ago, this changed because kids would always go with the older people to learn to do what Silver Temples do. However, it's really hard to tell whether a kid would grow up to be a man or a woman. So they kinda started to switch around, and for example, a girl would go with the men to hunt and gather. It didn't take long for people to realize that it didn't really matter, and nowadays you'll see men who are politicians and homemakers, and women who are hunters and gatherers. Men can be helpful in the settlements because they're strong and can lift stuff, and women can be helpful being hunter-gatherers because they don't have to use their eyes to see. How do they see? Well, North Dracoñe women use fire magic to see heat signatures and infrared light. They can see a distance away based on heat, so something warm surrounded by cold will stand out. Even if it's just a little difference, a trained Dracoñe can tell what it is, which is incredibly useful for sniffing out prey or avoiding being preyed on. That's right, even a large Dracoñe isn't the apex predator in the mountains. This is a medium to large sized beast called a grub. Most are 20 to 100 centimeters tall, but they can get as tall as 300. They feign a weak, shivery appearance as if they need help, but once prey gets close, they gape their mouth open wide to behead their prey and then eat the rest while it's fresh. Many careless Dracoñe have fallen to the glut, but one predator can fell even the most skilled Dracoñe warriors. The Calvin-Gen is a near-legendary monster from the Peak of Origin, the highest point on the planet. There are stories of it being the most intelligent life on Origin, but in reality its head is filled mostly with vital organs like a heart and lungs. I'll talk more about this strange beast soon, but for now all you gotta know is that it's a widely feared beast and largely considered the strongest individual living thing on the planet. If one absolutely must be slain, 10 of the best warriors are brought to make it as safe as possible. Even then, any wrong move could get someone or even the whole team killed. Many kings fight a Calvin-Gen one-on-one for glory, and many kings die from it. Speaking of kings, the Mendelgard lineage began in the north before the Dracoñe dispersion. Certain males from this lineage grow elaborate horns with markings like the eye of a dragon, one of whom is officially crowned king. In times past, a few side lineages from the Mendelgard throne would also have individuals with these kingly horns, but today only one man on the planet has them. An aging king who's so important to Ñushus culture and Origin as a whole that he has his own section in this video. Nowadays, kings are more of a Middle Dracoñe thing, but before I get to them, I want to talk about North Dracoñe cryptids. One cryptid specifically, the Wendigo. In particularly harsh winters, resources can become horribly scarce. If someone dies during this time, it can be tempting to use their body as, well, resources. The legends say that cannibalism can lead to someone transforming into a horrible monster, a beast that knows only hunger. It has a taste for Ñushus flesh, but no amount will satisfy it. Every time it eats, it grows longer, causing it to need more food than it did before. It's hanging on a thread of life, but isn't capable of dying. This cryptid doesn't actually exist, but many in the area still fear it. Sorry to break the immersion again, but I just want to note something. You've probably heard of Wendigos outside of this. That's because I mostly took the idea and story from Algonquian folklore. You've probably seen art of buff-antlered reindeer people, demons, under this name Wendigo. While those are cool on their own, they're not the representation given from folklore. I wanted to mention that because Ñushus obviously have horns, the Wendigo I made has horns. The idea of the Wendigo from real-world folklore is that it's emaciated and malnourished no matter what it eats, and the idea that it would grow hair and horns kinda goes against that to me. So I hope my Wendigo still respects the original folklore while being a cool thing on its own. Just wanted to add that disclaimer because native culture gets erased enough as it is, and I don't want to be a part of that. Okay, back to the video. In today's year of 2092, climate change has made the Glacian much warmer than it used to be. It's eerily nice while you're up there, but don't be fooled. The mountains are as harsh as always. Next up is the middle Dracoñe of Animapolis. That's the capital city of Draconia. There's a lot more than just Draconia there. It's a cultural melting pot and has been for thousands of years, so every Dracoñe has a bit of Taniyn blood and vice versa. Their skin color and some other features reflect that, though I'll talk more about Ñushus hybridization later. The definition of a Dracoñe is just that a Ñushus has red horns though, so it doesn't really mean much if they have brown hair or more orange to yellow skin. Like I said earlier, the Mendelgard line is from Middle Dracoñe, though royalty tended to have very little if any Taniyn blood until recently. The animal they choose to represent the city is the Murukruor, which they eat with reverence. It's a very scientific and philosophically focused culture, so they don't really worship any gods, but they treat the Murukruor almost like it's a deity and offer them their dead. Burial has never been a common practice, instead corpses are fed to the Murukruor so they can live on in the image of Draconia itself. While the outskirts of Animapolis has some farmland, they depend mostly on imports for food and other goods. So they eat food from all kinds of cultures. The Empire of Draconia has the most power in its capital city, and some people dislike Animapolis because of how much it can feel like the government is breathing down their neck. For example, it's a lot easier to hide how much you're making when you live a week's journey in an icy desert away from the central government, than if you live right there and the government technically owns your entire business anyway. Restrictions like this have loosened up a bit since the Good King broke up the Empire, and some people are confident he'll give up the rest of his power to set up a republic like Sudosians did. That's probably wishful thinking though, and some people are confident that the new invention of planes will make it easier for the government to tighten its grip on the rest of its territory, like what's happened in Anthropos. Even with all that, Animapolis is probably the safest city on Origin, or at least it is in some places. Anyway, there's one group of Ñushus that aren't even from Draconia territory, or at least it isn't Draconia territory anymore. The South Dracoñe of Cassowary are a less organized group of people who mostly inhabit what is now Sudosian territory. By most of their other Draconia peers, they are considered uncivilized hippies or nomads, and you'll hear people spinning wild tales of them eating huge birds right out of the sky. By younger Draconia and many Taniyn, the Cassowary people are considered the best people to go to if you want to party south of Jake Moss. People spin wild tales of their best parties, like them eating huge birds right out of the sky. What kind of huge bird? Well, it's the Murukruor. You can imagine that's a source of the drama between Cassowary and Animapolis. There's a few different settlements of Cassowary Ñushus that aren't really associated other than they're all viewed as the same weirdos by upper-class Animapolitans. There isn't much information about the other ones, but the ones closest to the north are the partiers everyone knows about. They shoot dragons out of the sky with their laser bombs, and cook them up to have a big dinner as soon as they hit the ground. From the occidental south where the Cassowary Draconia live, follow the coast clockwise to get up to the far west. The far West Taniyn of El Moña and El Sud are part of a huge and dense population of Ñushus. The collective of both cities are called the Dual Cities of El, which make up an alliance known outside as the Hermit Kingdoms. They managed to avoid the original war and spread of the Dracoñe, and they only knew each other in the last 1,000 years. Even though they fell under Draconia, the Dual Cities of El didn't change much apart from having to pay more taxes. They're a very secluded group of nations that prefer to keep outsiders away. Despite this, their unique culture and nature tends to attract tourists. They primarily eat fish, and lots of fish dishes around the world are inspired by El cuisine. The most notable thing about the Dual Cities of El nowadays is that the technology company is based there. It's the perfect spot, far enough away from the capital city to avoid the grip of government, while still being in an even larger city with a booming economy and plenty of resources. It's the most technologically advanced place on Origin, only rivaled by the capital city of Anthropos. The main difference is that tech here is magic focused, while tech in Anthropos is driven by their black gold. Elmonia is known in the weapons industry, where they test stuff on the desert to the east. El Sud is known in the agricultural industry, where they test stuff in the fields and water around them. Both have tons of other technology industries within them, but those are what they're most known for. On average, Elmonia tends to have richer people and nicer, larger apartments, while El Sud has a denser population and worse quality of life. Both are still extremely dense though, and excluding the Orient, 30% of Origin's population lives in one of those cities. It's obviously the biggest group of Taniyn, and the smallest group lives in the desert to the west. The Midwest Taniyn of the Tombstone Relic are a once unknown group of Ñushus that became famous once one of their own married Dracoñe's king to give birth, or I guess lay egg, to the current King Louis Mendelgard. Louis? No one really knows how to pronounce his first name, so they call him the Good King. These Taniyn lived a quiet life in the oasis within the Tombstone Desert that was once an exile ground for the Relic Ñushus long ago. They take pride in their heritage and consider themselves true Taniyn. After all, that word comes from the old Relic word for exile. Tanianopolis, a city we'll talk about next, was named not for its inhabitants of Taniyn today, but for its history as the place where they'd ship prisoners deep into the desert. Anyway, the woman who married the Good King's father, a man of the same name, was special herself. She captured Louis' heart with the curly red hair of their Relic ancestors, the people who fascinated the king, who considered himself a scientist and a historian. Apparently, less than 1% of Midwest Taniyn are born with curly red hair, and it's not any mutation seen anywhere else. Although it's recessive compared to the dark straight hair of most other Taniyn, it must be more dominant than the blonde wavy hair of most Dracoñe, because the Good King has it too. I'll talk more about genetics later though. Yeah, I am going to talk about the genetics of my oddly proportioned cow crocodile guys in this already too long video about their anthropology. You got a problem? Anyway, life in the Tombstone Relic is harsh with drastic temperatures on both sides. Even in the oasis, it can get up to 40 degrees at midday and down to -10 at midnight. Like I said earlier, Tombstone Taniyn are much more likely to be able to sweat into adulthood, which is a very useful thing to do in the heat of the desert. An animal that has great meaning to them is a Cyclops, a powerful psychic that can brave the desert's harshest environments. Long ago, they were tamed by Taniyn to attack Dracoñe trying to invade, though at some point that art was lost and they're all wild now. Even though the Tombstone Desert is technically Dracoñe territory, it's notably hard to traverse, so Midwestern Taniyn have always been relatively free from their government's influence. They're a self-sustaining society, so most of their troubles have come from within. One of their most famous cryptids is something called a ghoul. Tombstone is famous for its cryptids, but the ghoul has become a worldwide media entertainment phenomenon. It's said to be a demon in the body of a tall and thin Ñushus that lives in graveyards and eats dead bodies to make more space for new ones. It seems like this really is how tombstone graveyards work. Older graves become empty one day and are replaced with a new body. So, wait, ghouls obviously aren't real, so where are those old bodies actually going? Anyway, let's talk more about Tanianopolis. The Middle Taniyn of Tanianopolis and Anamopolis are basically the Middle Dracoñe of Taniyn, in that they live in a bit of a melting pot. Both cities are populated with Dracoñe and Taniyn, who haven't really been segregated in hundreds of years. Before Dracoñe took over, Tanianopolis was the chosen capital city of Taniyn rebels. It was symbolic that they took it back from their Relic overlords. This didn't last long and it fell back under the Dracoñe. Even though Taniyn were lower class until almost 100 years ago, that didn't stop very many people from doing the Yongi Sploinky. Anyway, Middle Taniyn are generally the most culturally laid back. They don't freak out over short pants or bare chests like most older Dracoñe do. Thanks to this, Tanianopolis has had an increasing number of new residents as years go by, and as of last year has actually surpassed Anamopolis in population. Also, there's actually more Dracoñe in Tanianopolis than Taniyn. It's been that way for a while though. The Good King's late wife and mother to their children was Middle Taniyn, and apart from her, there were many notable Middle Taniyn in the historical scientific field. Unfortunately, we don't know many of their names because of a history of Dracoñe taking credit for their work. For example, notable douchebag Aaron Danson was once a notable scientist who was known for the discovery of many chemical elements in the 1800s. It was known that he had a landlording business, but was assumed that he did science on the side. It came out recently, though, that he had stolen work from one of his Taniyn tenants, and never wrote down their name. Unfortunately, the scientific field is filled with stories like this, especially in Taniynopolis, but there are times we can find the identity of the person who really did the work. One such example is Lee Peanuts, who founded lots of electrical technology without the need for magic, such as the light bulb. But that's enough with magic cartoon racism. What happens when two of them love each other very much? As interested as I am in animal hybridization, and most people are animals, it just sounds weird to use that term for people. They're not that different. So even though some people call them hybrid Ñushus, they tend to call themselves Drañyn. I'll use that term from here on out. What defines a Drañyn is just that they have yellow horns, but I need an excuse to talk about genetics, so I'm going to do that now. I feel like no one's going to get this far in the video, but if you did, 1, I appreciate you, and 2, feel free to skip these 2 bio sections. This is my channel, so even if no one watches, I'm going to info dump about genetics, but you don't have to watch it. Anyway, I don't actually know that much about genetics, like I haven't taken a college class on it or anything, so I'm probably simplifying this a lot. Let me know if I get stuff wrong, or if you got any cool genetics facts. I love that stuff. The second one, I don't love getting stuff wrong. Everyone has at least 2 of each gene, getting 1 copy from each of their parents. Sometimes 1 copy is dominant and the other is recessive, meaning the dominant ones are what show up in the person's body. An example in Ñushus is that dark hair is the most dominant, then red, then blonde. That's why most Drañyn have dark hair. Curly hair also seems to be more dominant than wavy, which is more dominant than straight. Other times, both copies work together in a way. For example, 1 gene for red horns and another for green makes a Drañyn with yellow horns. There's also times when lots of genes do more or less the same thing, which explains why there's a lot more than 3 different Ñushus skin colors. All of them work together to make some shade between red and green. Past that, genes can interact in hard to predict ways. Drañyn are usually quite a bit taller on average than either their parents because they get the long torso of the Dracoñe parent and the long legs of their Taniyn parent. However, there's an exception. The daughter of a male Taniyn and female Dracoñe will have the short torso and the short legs. Another example of weird genetic stuff is how Drañyn usually inherit the metabolic patterns of the parent with a similar hormone balance. An exception to that is the good king himself, who's somewhere in the middle. Remember, Dracoñe have a slower metabolism and gain fat easier, while Taniyn have a faster metabolism and tend to keep slim. And no, I have no idea why those genes express themselves that way. Let me get more into what I meant by hormone balance though. Yeah, I've decided right now that I want to talk more about biology. Again, feel free to skip. Ñushus, like any other animal, have a litany of hormones, but the ones relevant here are the sex hormones estrogen and testosterone. Ñushus hatch with horns, which store a lot of excess energy. Without intervention from sex hormones, horns will always grow outward, but a storage of nutrients collects at the base. That's why any healthy baby Ñushus horns will have a plump base. However, sex hormones change this. Both are similar in that they cause a sharp reduction in myostatin, meaning there's not much limiting their muscle growth. The nutrients that went to their horns are now mostly going to that muscle, and are replaced mostly by fat deposits in Dracoñe and water storage in Taniyn. Drañyn get more of an even mix. Both also accelerate the fusion of growth plates, especially in the legs, though estrogen has a stronger effect on it than testosterone. That just means estrogen causes a Ñushus to not grow as tall, like we've seen before. High amounts of testosterone also cause that thing with the eyes, you know the one. High amounts of testosterone cause the Ñushus horns to fork and make that signature shape everyone loves. Estrogen also seems to shape the horns a bit, because without either sex hormone, they stay relatively straight. With all that in mind, you might understand intersex Ñushus a bit better, and why they look how they do. I promise I'll get back to Drañyn after this. I didn't even mean for this tangent to go so long, but you don't mind, do you? There are 2 main kinds of intersex in Ñushus. Not to make a binary out of everything, Obviously, there's Ñushus somewhere in between for all of these, but that would make this video even gosh darn longer. To make stuff easier to study and understand, we categorize as much as we can. Anyway, the one with the crossed arrow symbol on the left has high levels of estrogen and testosterone, while the one with just a circle symbol has barely any of either hormone. Most intersex Ñushus are somewhere between these, but categorizing it can help decide what treatment they want or if they want treatment at all. Ñushus society in general can be pretty heavily gendered, so you can imagine someone who doesn't exhibit much of either sex can be discriminated against pretty heavily, sometimes even more than someone who transitions from one side of the binary to another. I chose those two cryptids I talked about earlier because they're the most popular, yeah, but it's likely that they were used in reference to intersex Ñushus to justify violence against them. That doesn't mean it's wrong to enjoy old horror movies that involve them, though. Lots of younger intersex people take back the Wendigo and the Ghoul and use it to empower themselves and their cause. Hi, it's me breaking the immersion again. I feel like I should really emphasize that these are cartoon magical little guys I made up. Please don't take any of it too seriously, and definitely don't take it as information regarding human intersex people. Obviously, I took some time to learn about them before writing this, but I'm not at all an expert and I don't want to misinterpret actual real people. Still, I really hope they're a cool and fun part of this made-up world's history. Back to Drañyn. Remember Drañyn? In times long past, they were pretty controversial, but nowadays everyone thinks they're really weird if you make a big deal about them. There's not a whole lot to talk about when it comes to their culture, but there are some fun things that happen as a result of combining two of the ones we've talked about. Surf and turf is a now popular dish that combines seafood with meat, or really anything that comes from land. It originated from someone whose father was a North Dracoñe game hunter, and mother was a far West Taniyn fisherman. They combined the two to make something that stood the test of time. The person who invented the water gun was half Midwest Taniyn and half South Dracoñe. They were inspired by the Tanyyn's need to keep cool and Dracoñe's need to party. Heck yeah, love water guns. The most notable Johnny in history, however, is the Good King. But before I talk more about him, I'll have to tell you about Dracoñe's government and economy. Dracoñe is a mixed capitalist monarchy. Animapolis is mostly a state capitalist economy, with the government owning most businesses and the means of production, while the rest of the country is mostly a private capitalist economy, with the citizens owning most of that stuff. There's state-owned healthcare across Dracoñe, but it hasn't always been as cheap as it is now. Same with wheat and corn, though it's pretty common to see private-owned companies selling higher quality grains. The king's main responsibility is to command the armed forces, especially during wartime, but there hasn't been any wartime for a few hundred years, so the king doesn't actually have to do much. They can decree and undecree laws as they see fit, and veto laws or acts made by lower management. So even though kings have a lot of power, they usually have a lot of free time if they don't use it much. Their advisors and governors or managers of smaller divisions and territories are usually the ones who have a lot of work to do. The main division is the cities, but there are also boroughs and or smaller sections of larger cities that have their own management as well. The city governors or mayors usually have a wide reach of power as long as they stay within the king's national laws and acts. After the Good King broke up the empire, everything within Dracoñe stayed mostly the same, while governors of cities that are now outside Dracoñe obviously gained a whole lot of power now that they don't have to stay within the Good King's graces. The huge empire was divided into 8 countries, one of them being Dracoñe. Sodosia became more strictly privatized, but set up a republic with elected leaders. Lycan leaned into its monarchy, but also became more socialist with state-owned businesses. Buxana didn't really change much, but its economy has boomed since its independence. The soda they make there is poppin'. Nectarida is still a monarchy, and their economy is also doing quite well. They make a lot from their citizens who live outside the country, though there might be trouble brewing within it. Arbo has a much simpler honor-based economy, and since Dracoñe didn't tax them before, nothing really changed after their independence. Eidolon never really had any people in it, but that awful island is someone else's problem now. Senex has become a bit of an anarchy, though there is some good old yeehaw gunsling capitalism going on there. Anyway, let's talk about the current king of Dracoñe. The tallest king in recorded history, the Good King stands at 242 centimeters. In 2079, he weighed 201 kilograms and could wield the Relic axe and the King's Gauntlet to overpower any monster in his path. Even the legendary Calvingen fell to his laser bombs. Where an ordinary Ñushus warrior would require 9 talented teammates to safely take down one Calvingen, the Good King can do it on his own. He owes a lot of his strength to his parents and did his best to teach his kids how to take care of themselves. Let's talk about his family. He learned most of his combat skills from his mother, Sara Terra. She was the best mage in Tombstone, and her control over the Relic axe was obvious and impressive. Unfortunately, she was assassinated after the Good King's coronation, which shined a light on a lot of the problems within the country. The Good King was named after his father, Louis Mandogard, and probably got a lot of his love of science and history from his father. After Terra's death, the old king was overcome with grief and disappeared into the mountains. Part of the Good King's obsession with slaying Calvingen came from this, and he eventually found the remains of his father in the stomach of one of the beasts. He had a sister who left the royal family after the whole debacle. She's very difficult to track down nowadays, so we couldn't find a good picture newer than 2066. Our intelligence says she lives in the mountains with a Rifa maid in the outskirts of the settlement at the foot of Origin. Despite his tragic backstory, the Good King still managed to find success. He married a Middle Taniyn woman he met during his visits to the scientific museums in Tanyanopolis. They bonded over their shared interests in education and history, but Camille was also a political activist with a lot against the Menelgard regime. They would talk for hours every day about politics and how things should or shouldn't change, and the Good King started to see her point of view. As he tells it, Camille wouldn't marry him if he didn't use his power to improve sapient rights or concede his power to people who would. Little by little, she influenced him to break up the legendary empire and allow for new nations to have their own power. He did it establishing a chair of national leaders from the Achadan and the Glacian. Sure, he was still the chairman of this alliance, but they were no longer his subjects. When he did this in 2069 was when people started to call him the Good King. He made history and is a symbol of peace and prosperity around Origin. He dropped the price of state-owned healthcare to an all-time low, and started programs that gave free food and healthcare to people who needed it. He was the first Menelgard king to go to Anthropos and meet their king, and he was treated well his whole time there. Usually, the Anthroposian king threatens death to anyone who isn't human, but it seems like King Julius Cor was smarter than that. The Good King and Camille had twins together in 2072, and decided that was enough kids for one lifetime. As the crown prince, Valentine went through a lot of stressful training to be a king worthy of succeeding the Good King. But he was always kind and empathetic to all he came across. He was friends with the most popular kids in his school, like his sister Chloe and the Emperor's son Napoleon, but his best friend was an outcast named Anna, who was the daughter of the king's main advisor. Chloe was usually second fiddle to her sibling, but her personality is anything but submissive. She made a point of outperforming Valentine at every turn, and always seemed more enthusiastic about being a powerful king than he was. In 2075, tragedy struck again as Camille fell ill with an incurable disease that slowly sapped her strength. In 2079, Valentine disappeared, and quickly after that, Camille succumbed to her illness and passed away. Chloe always had disagreements with her dad as she went into her teenage years, and after a misunderstanding, she ran away in 2090. Today, it's 2092, when Valentine would have turned 20 and been coronated, but he still hasn't been found. Despite the Good King wishing to solve any disputes with Chloe, she hasn't returned either. The Good King is aging, and at the moment, no successors have been named. Everyone around Origin is left to speculate. How much longer does the old man have, and what happens when he runs out of time? And that's all I got for this video. Check out my Patreon where you can subscribe for just $1 a month to support me and get your name at the end of my videos. Thanks Captain Cobalt and Art of Dying. It'll be a while before I delve into another anthropology video, but if I do, it'll probably be about sapient predators and sapient prey. You know the ones. Hope to see you there, consider subscribing, and thanks for watching.